In the Middle Ages, there were many strange traditions and rituals that can shock people from the 21st century. This is something you definitely weren't told about in history class at school. In this video, you will learn about the craziest and strangest medieval traditions. Divorce in the Middle Ages was truly bloody. Many people think that divorce is a practice that appeared relatively recently, in the last couple of centuries. However, it was possible to get divorced even in the Middle Ages, though the process looked completely different back then. For example, in medieval Germany, there was a practice of trial by combat between spouses. This way, a husband and wife could settle disputes and even carry out a divorce, though it could only be initiated by one side. These duels accounted for the differences in physical strength between men and women, which is why there were unusual rules. The husband was placed waist deep in a pit dug in the ground, with one hand tied behind his back, and in the other hand he held something like a sword or a sharpened stick. The woman was armed with several stones wrapped in cloth. This weapon weighed several kilograms. The man could not leave his pit, but the woman was free to run around and strike blows. It all ended quite harshly. If the loser didn't die during the fight, they were executed. The famous words from the wedding vow, "Till death do us part," had a whole new meaning in the Middle Ages.
Animal trials.
Imagine this. A real courtroom session is taking place, but instead of a human defendant, it's a pig. In the Middle Ages, this was absolutely normal. Animals could be put on trial and sentenced to death. There are plenty of historical documents confirming this. For example, in 1457 inches, the town of Savigny, France, a sensational trial took place. A pig and 5 piglets stood before the court. They were accused of attacking a child, which resulted in the child's death. The trial followed all formal rules. Along with the judge, there were prosecutors, several witnesses, and even a defense. As a result, the judge found the pig guilty and acquitted the piglets. For the pig, everything ended with execution. Such cases may seem bizarre, but in medieval Europe, animal trials were a common occurrence. Pigs, cows, goats, horses, and dogs that allegedly broke the law were often subjected to the same legal procedures as humans. But the most notorious offenders, judging by preserved records, were pigs. They behaved quite wildly and often attacked people. However, the law could be harsh not only toward animals, but also toward humans who were cruel to them. There are medieval records of death sentences being given to people for extreme abuse of animals. Women pluck their eyebrows and eyelashes. Today, women spend a lot of time caring for their eyebrows, trying to emphasize them and make them bolder. But, for example, in the first half of the 15th century, women's ideas of beauty were completely different. At that time, they wanted to have a high forehead and an oval face with a small nose and lips. The ideal beauty standard was to resemble the pure face of a child, so all facial hair was removed. Women plucked not only their eyebrows and eyelashes, but even parts of their hairline to push it back as far as possible. The eyes remained the only colorful accent on the face, and a sad, emotionless face was considered beautiful. By the way, many believe that this is why Leonardo da Vinci's famous Mona Lisa has no eyebrows. But that's not true. First, the portrait was painted in the early 16th century, by which time this trend had passed. Second, experts discovered that Mona Lisa's eyebrows had been painted originally, but were erased during an early restoration. Medieval shoes with very long toes, and other strange fashion trends. You've probably noticed shoes with long toes in movies about the Middle Ages. But in reality, this fashion was even crazier and funnier. This type of shoe was especially popular in 15th century Europe. They were called polanes. The length of the shoe's toe varied. As a rule, the more noble a person was, the longer their shoe's toe. Many people tried to make it as long as possible to show off their status. Only nobles could afford to walk in such uncomfortable shoes because it was simply impossible to work in them. To keep the long toe firm and in shape, it was stuffed with something soft, like wool. Otherwise, it would drag on the ground, making walking difficult and looking ugly. The shoes themselves were usually made of leather. Archaeologists have found pollens many times during excavations. This is partly because fashion didn't change nearly as quickly as it does today. A certain style could remain trendy for centuries, so a person could wear the same shoes almost their whole life and still be considered stylish. This wasn't the only strange clothing trend of the Middle Ages. Another example was the codpiece, a pouch men wore below the waist. The codpiece could be found both on knights' armor and in everyday outfits. In armor, it served a protective purpose for vital organs, but in everyday clothing, it was mainly aesthetic. It was meant to emphasize masculinity. Since men often wore tight stockings, the codpiece was very noticeable. That was, of course, the point. Some men wore it under clothing, while others attached it outside, directly on the belt. The codpiece was especially popular in the 15th, 16th centuries. For example, in many portraits of the famous English King Henry VIII. This feature is very easy to spot. Football was banned in medieval England. England is considered the birthplace of football and one of the sport's global leaders. But in the Middle Ages, football was actually illegal. That's because 700 years ago, the game was much more violent, chaotic, and dangerous than today. Some players even died during matches. There were no clear rules at all. Matches could involve an unlimited number of players, and to gain possession of the ball, almost anything was allowed. In the early 14th century, the English king banned football because of its extreme violence. Those who broke the king's decree were sent to prison. Just imagine how brutal the game looked back then if even medieval people thought it was too violent. The wedding night with witnesses and other strange wedding traditions. It won't surprise anyone to learn that medieval marriages, especially among the upper classes, were rarely based on love. Instead, they were made for political and social gain. And of course, women had no say in the matter. In fact, men and women were considered ready for marriage at the age of 13-14, which seems very strange today. The wedding ceremony itself was also very different. For starters, couples didn't need special approval from a government authority. They could marry instantly, simply by expressing consent. That's why weddings could happen anywhere in the street, in a tavern, or at home. Today, it's often difficult to prove whether some medieval couples were officially married. But perhaps the most interesting fact about medieval weddings was the tradition of the first wedding night. Among the upper class, this was far from a private event. Besides the bride and groom, witnesses were present in the room to ensure that conception took place. The only privacy they might have came from bed curtains, though not everyone owned them. April Fool's Day was celebrated in the Middle Ages. However, the holiday didn't take place on the 1st of April, but in early January. This tradition came to Christian Europe from pagan customs. The idea of the medieval Fool's Festival was that nobles swapped roles with the lowest classes. Servants acted as masters for a day, and nobles served as their attendants. During the celebration, everyone dressed in costumes, sang obscene songs, and drank excessively. Being a jester was not as fun as it might seem. Their role was reflected in their famous hats, which were made to resemble donkey ears, but this treatment had its advantages. Since everything that came out of a jester's mouth was perceived as a joke and not taken seriously, they could get away with bold and even insulting remarks toward nobles, or even make political statements. And finally, a short fact. As you know, today money is the universal way people exchange goods and services. But this wasn't always the case. For a long time in history, shells were used as currency. Even though coins already existed in the Middle Ages, there were also more extravagant types of currency. For example, eels. Yes, the snake-like fish. A medieval document has survived, describing how someone rented land in exchange for 26,000 eels.